little bit over.
That's fine.
So
yes.
I just
I'll give you time.
don't be like super.
No, I won't stand up with a big red sign.
Yeah.
But just to give you guides,
Okay.
I think I have you marked up for 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, right?
30, okay.
So I'll
Yeah,
give
if
you
we
signs.
start with 30,
Right.
and then if I go under, that's fine, and if I, we'll just, okay. Because I have about 14 pages. Okay. So, sound, do we need a sound check?
Do you think it's possible to go a little bit closer? If not,
I mean, it will be just kind of,
I'm sure you're right. Oh, it sounds like it's on. Vibrant. Yes, it should be fine. I look her up. Thank you so much.
should I be?
I think we are ready to start. Does this mic work? Do you hear me well? Okay. Now it works. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session. I'm Salim Çevik. I'm a fellow at German Institute for International and Security Affairs. It's better known with its German acronyms, SWP. It's really an honor for me to moderate this session, Caliphate Without Place, and I'm from Turkey, where the Caliphate's last residence was in Istanbul. I lived 2 years very close to his last residence. And in Turkey, occasionally, particularly in times of crisis that now we are experiencing in Palestine, there are some more nostalgic arguments coming from religious intellectuals, publicists, saying that if the caliphate was not abolished, things would have been different and the Muslim world would weigh in more significantly in times of such crisis. So it's such a tragedy that it was abolished. And the official narrative against it is that basically it doesn't matter because the official narrative claims that nobody really cared about the caliphate outside the borders of Turkey. It might appear as a global, multinational, transnational institution, but in reality, its influence was limited within the borders of the Ottoman Empire, which shrinked a lot, basically, to the Republic of Turkey. So it wouldn't have made any difference. And I mean, this is the official narrative, and surprisingly, I would say the scholarly literature also pretty much shares this official narrative, largely. And I personally didn't have any research on this topic particularly, but anyone who is remotely familiar with the Indian subcontinental history, for instance, which I'm only remotely familiar with, and we have excellent experts in the room, but would know that the Caliphate as an institution and the Khilafat movement was a foundational moment for the formation of Muslim political identities in the subcontinent. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So being aware of this, I always find it a little bit surprising that this, not only the official narrative, but also the scholarly community easily dismisses this institution as practically irrelevant on political affairs. And we have two excellent speakers who would have different alternative views on this issue. Let me introduce them very briefly. First, our keynote speaker is Mona Hassan, an associate professor of Islamic Studies and History at Duke University. Mona obtained her PhD from Princeton University and specializes in global Islamic history. She has researched and published also on the shifting contours of women's Islamic legal scholarship from the emergence of Muslim community, starting from all the way to 7th century to the secular interventions of modern nation states. And her first book, Longing for the Lost Caliphate, a Trans-Regional History, published from Princeton University Press and received the American Academy of Religion's 2017 award for excellence in the study of religion in the category of historical studies. So we have a very ideal speaker for to make an intervention on this topic. The book examines, it's a long durée analysis. I think it's kind of your style as an historian, but based on other works as well. With the notion of an Islamic caliphate, its loss, and not only once, twice in the history, first in the 13th century and later in the 20th century, and how the Muslim world kind of dealt with this loss, and how this memories of caliphate, of the lost caliphate, percolated through Muslim culture, law, and politics across Afro-Eurasia. And after Mona, Jonathan Laurence will be our discussant. Jonathan is not only the head of the Clough Center and the brains behind this conference, but he is also a professor of political science at Boston College. His PhD is from Harvard University in government, and his research interests are comparative politics and religion and politics in Western Europe, Turkey, and North Africa. His first two books is about Muslims in Europe. First one, Integrating Islam, Religious and Political Challenge in Contemporary France. In the second book, he broadened the scope of emancipation of European Muslims. And if you believe that emancipation of European Muslims is a broad topic, I would just suggest you to look at his last book, which is the relevant book for our today's discussion. It's Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicism, and the Modern State, again published by Princeton University Press. I will not take more of your time because I'm sure everybody is looking forward to listen to our excellent speakers. I will just make a logistical announcements. There is also a restroom downstairs in the below floor, so you can also use that during the coffee breaks. And Mona, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, and I'm very excited about the topic. I wanted to start with an image or a series of images that encapsulate the question at hand for today's discussion about place, or the idea of caliphate without place. But before that, perhaps a quick introduction to the key term for this session, caliphate. The term caliphate itself means succession, specifically to the Prophet Muhammad, who Muslims believe was the final messenger sent by God to all of humanity. So the question of the caliphate is essentially a question about who would continue to lead and guide the Muslim community after his death, albeit without access to direct and ongoing divine revelation. So for many Muslims, the caliphate has historically constituted a symbol of Islam itself, one deeply embedded in a rich intellectual and cultural discourse that could readily evoke a sense of the wider community's glory, righteousness, and esteem. For some, hearkening back to the earliest caliphal models, it signaled to the potential of the Muslim community to live up to the best interpretations of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, to constitute a model and mercy for the rest of humanity, and to assume a position of virtuous leadership and benevolent guidance, mandated by Islamic law as necessary to safeguard the Muslim community's temporal and spiritual affairs. The caliphate became enmeshed in numerous jurisprudential rulings that had developed over centuries of vibrant discussion and debate. And as an institution with its genesis in the early days of Islam, the caliphate offered a potent mode of connectivity with the Muslim community's cultural, religious, legal, and historical heritage, as well as with its ideals of solidarity. Therefore, its absence seemed inconceivable and created an aching void for many, and hence its continual reference in times especially of distress. So to turn to our images, when I first received this proposed concept for the cover of my book from my wonderful editor and design team at Princeton University Press, I was deeply dismayed. The designer was excited to work with this image from the interior illustrations of my book because it was visually interesting, colorful, and would wrap nicely around the jacket. Yet as I passionately and rather desperately pushed back, the selection of this image missed the point. Yes, it came from another manuscript illustration I had tracked down of Baghdad in flood, a mere 2 years before the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1258. And yes, pre-modern historians would integrate this and other natural disasters into a comprehensive narrative of Baghdad's subsequent demise. But that was a tangential argument to the book as a whole. The Caliphate was not about buildings. It was not about Baghdad. Simply put, it was not about place. Rather, the Caliphate was about people, about relationships, memories, losses, and aspirations. And all of these combined imbued places with special meaning and significance. But the locus could shift and change, and it certainly did. For years, I had envisioned that another manuscript illustration would feature prominently on my book's cover about longing for the lost caliphate. This one features the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, al-Mustasim Billah, being brought on his knees before the Mongol military commander Hülegu, before the caliph was royally executed and the city's population brutally massacred. This image signifies that moment of traumatic loss and points to the import of the caliphate in terms of cultural memory for Muslims across time and space, which is why I was elated for it to finally become the actual cover of my book, as those of you who are familiar with it. And the designer did a fabulous job of actually honing in on that interaction between Hülegu, who's on the right, and the last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad on his knees on the left, on the bottom left. And you can see his Mongol captors behind him holding that, which turns out does wrap nicely around the dust jacket with a little bit of creative work. And you can see his, the Mongol captors holding him with his hands behind his back a little bit more clearly on the side of the dust jacket. To be clear, I'm not negating the significance of place in Islamic history as a whole. Other scholars like Zaidi Antrim have written at length about the import of concepts like the homeland and nation, or watan, before the advent of nationalism and contributing to contemporary concepts of nationalism as well. And countless others like Beth Barron, Rashid Khalidi, and our colleagues here today have written about it amid the modern era of nation states. Even in connection to the caliphate, we cannot negate the significance of place. The universal aspiring caliphate moved in general terms from the great centers of Medina to Damascus, to Baghdad, to Cairo, to Istanbul, creating a seamless narrative of Islamic leadership that was only punctured by the worrisome absence of a caliphate following the calamities of 1258 and 1924. In Baghdad, we witness how contemporaries mourned the loss of their relatives, friends, and the city as they once knew it through expressive poetry, symbolized by the loss of the caliph and the caliphate itself. Here, the Abbasid court scribe, Yaqut al-Mustasimi, vividly brings out the emotional sense of bereavement that he and others felt in this short but eloquent piece, raising themes that other poets would also explore. So, in translation, "Oh, that gathering whose splendor I have lost. Oh, how events have conjoined against me. Since I lost sight of those faces, my eyes have not seen beauty. I miss all those who used to keep me company. I am a wandering stranger in my own country. May my soul never reach its aspirations if it should find solace after you in any other dwelling. The one who loves you, O people of Baghdad, taught the pigeon on a branch how to wail." The absence of those faces familiar and dear leaves him exceptionally disoriented in his own land, a sudden stranger, unable to find inner comfort or even appreciate the sight of beauty because of the extent of his grief. Immersed in this painful state of alienation and deep mourning, Yaqut al-Mustasimi supposes that it can only be one who has loved these vanished dwellers of Baghdad, foremost among them the Caliph, who was his mentor, who inscribed the Arabic poetic emblem of sorrow, the cooing of a lone pigeon. Let me actually go back for a second. But for Muslims far and wide, it was the Caliphate, as a symbol of their transregional community, that imparted the significance to these places and not vice versa. Hence, we see authors like Tajuddin as-Subki writing in Mamluk Syria and Egypt a full century after the passing of the Abbasid Caliphate from Baghdad, with the explicit aim of perpetuating the collective significance of this calamity for an enduring, effective community of believers connected across time and space. And just an interesting aside for a moment, as I was writing this and reflecting on it, I recognized that we just passed the centennial of the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate, which was March 3rd. So from March 3rd, 1924 to March 3rd, 2024. So it's actually, it's quite interesting to see that as-Subki, it was writing a century after the abolition of the Abbasid Caliphate, and we are here together thinking about the implications in a world of nation states about the lasting ramifications of the loss of the Ottoman Caliphate. Both of the two audiences that as-Subki specifies in his narrative discussing the loss of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and the massacre associated with it are connected to a unique form of temporality. One, Muslims who may live at any future point of time, and two, historians who engage in sifting through and evaluating traces of the past. Illustrating the relativity of time from the perspective of memory across generations, as-Subki's work indicates new social dimensions of the major contributions of Henry Bergson, that the time of memory does not exist in discrete measurable units. Rather, it endures and may be telescoped or expanded in our recollections by the intensity of the emotions it inspires or the vividness of the imagery it invokes. At the close of his account, as-Subki layers on another dimension of transregionality, passionately articulating a vision of these historical events' import beyond those immediately affected in Baghdad. Returning to his initial point, addressed to historians, of the unprecedented carnage and horrors of the Mongol invasion, as-Subki reflects that even if the world had experienced worse than it, the events of 1258 and the killing of the Abbasid Caliphate in the heart of Muslim domains were associated with the humiliation of the religion of Islam, Awanuddin, and therefore constituted, quote, a tribulation that was not limited, but rather afflicted all other Muslims. This vision of the past conceives of an integral Muslim community interconnected across time and space that is carefully attuned to the cultural symbolism of the assault on Baghdad and its caliph. And writing in Mamluk Syria roughly 100 years later, it is a vision that as-Subki assiduously seeks to cultivate. One of the most persuasive ways that contemporary scholars have sought to describe this transregional sociocultural reality is John Voll's concept of a discourse-based world system. In arguing for the existence of a particular world system that offered a sense of cohesion and shared identity, following the onset of the political disintegration of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 10th century, so that is a few centuries before the Mongol invasions, Voll notes, the Islamic discourse was able to cross boundaries between urban-based and pastoral agrarian societies and those between the different major traditions of civilization in the Afro-Eurasian landmass. Networks of personal and organizational interaction created at least a minimal sense of corporate communal identity in the vast emerging world system. In developing this analytical apparatus, Voll integrates insights from the global historian Marshall Hodgson's seminal scholarship on Islamic history, economist Emanuel Wallerstein's influential work delineating the modern capitalist world system, and sociologist of religion Bob Wuthnow's assessment of communities of discourse. In Wallerstein's take on the uniqueness of the modern capitalist world system, he says, this is from the Modern World System, prior to the modern era, world economies were highly unstable structures which tended either to be converted into empires or to disintegrate. It is the peculiarity of the modern world system that a world economy has survived for 500 years and yet has not come to be transformed into a world empire, a peculiarity that is the secret of its strength. This peculiarity is the political side of the form of economic organization called capitalism. Yet by shifting the time frame earlier, other scholars like Janet Lippmann Abu-Lughod have located a complex and prosperous predecessor that integrated societies across Afro-Eurasia into a pre-modern world system of remarkable commercial and cultural exchange. And this is a diagram that is connected. Her book is entitled Before European Hegemony, The World System, AD 1250 to 1350, where she looks at the height or the peak of this world system, as she terms it, in the 13th century. And you can see here, I hope you can see in the back there, the different circuits that enabled this, these different regions of the world to be connected. So it might not be, there are rare individuals that might travel across all of these circuits, but because they overlap, they enable the functioning of an integrated and functional world system. From another angle, John Voll considers how the Islamic experience reveals a new way to formulate world systems theory itself. He explicitly argues that, quote, the modern capitalist world system was not the first long-lasting world system without a world empire. So in reformulating Wallerstein's own phrasing of this peculiarity, Voll notes, it is the peculiarity of the Islamic world system, since roughly 1000, that a world society survived for almost 1,000 years and yet has not become transformed into either a world empire or a world economy, a peculiarity that is the secret of its strength and ability to survive. In other words, both the modern capitalist and the Islamic discourse-based world systems are relatively comprehensive social systems that can qualify as world systems, according to John Voll, even as their primary identifying characteristics are drawn from different dimensions of these social systems. But I would like to focus in on the last few words for a moment about the ability of the Islamic world system to endure and to continue to coexist with the modern capitalist world system. As Voll concludes, the Islamic community had already developed such a world system without a world empire in the centuries following the collapse of the Abbasid state by the 10th century. This non-imperial world system was not based on a world economy. Instead, it was a discourse-based world system tied together by interactions on a broad community of discourse, rather than by an exchange of goods. The capitalist world system strongly influenced this Islamic world system, but it did not destroy it. This parallel set of world systems helps us to understand the lasting resonance of the Caliphate as a cultural symbol down to the present. And our deep dive leads us to the 1920s, where discussions around the tumultuous abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate based in Istanbul, amid a sea wave of emerging nation states, continues to shape the current range of Muslim perspectives and opinions. Similar to the calamity of 1258, the traumatic disappearance of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924 generated an outpouring of emotion far beyond the territorial boundaries of imperial domains, and illustrates the limitations of conventional political and historiographical boundaries in investigating such phenomena. Muslims from southeastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, China, South Asia, and Southeast Asia expressed profound consternation, again, far beyond the political and territorial reach of the Ottoman Empire at the time of its demise. In the early 20th century, Muslims around the world actively imagined ways to retain and reconfigure the caliphate that had so potently symbolized that interconnected discursive community, or ummah. And All of the efforts to recalibrate and revitalize this venerable religious institution possessing broad transregional appeal were shaped and challenged by the dynamics of a newly emerging system of nation states. These vibrant discussions of the early 20th century over how to revive a caliphate best suited to the modern world merged a sensibility of Islamic transregionalism with the infectious spirit of a new age of global internationalism. Yet the ideas and solutions articulated at this critical juncture were far-ranging and widely disparate. So to bring a moment of levity into this discussion, when my editor first read my chapter about the range of ideas emerging in an international context in this time period, whether that be a depoliticized spiritual institution, an international council, a global electorate, or a traditional caliphate, he immediately grasped that the whole enterprise to reinstate a caliph at the beginning of the 20th century was doomed. So maybe that's just a little bit of dark humor, but nonetheless. When faced with the disappearance of a traditional Islamic caliphate, as represented by the Ottomans, a Pandora's box of possibilities had opened up by the 1920s. Several figures whom I discuss at more length in my book illustrate some of these myriad paths forward. So I just wanted to connect and show you, to go over a few different ways of the trajectories that were set in the 1920s that continue to resonate in the present. Islamic modernists like Said Bey in Turkey and Ali Abdul Razak in Egypt argued in favor of secular governance. This first set and the one that follows have received the lion's share of academic and journalistic attention. Islamic activists, lay activists like Hassan al-Banna, the Egyptian founder of the Society of Muslim Brothers, organized Islamist alternatives and opposition. These, of course, are the ones who get all of the news coverage, whatever the latest passing iteration of that may be. Jurists like Mustafa Sabri, who was the second to last Ottoman Sheikh al-Islam, so basically the empire's highest-ranking religious bureaucrat, continued to accommodate changing political structures by embracing identifiably Muslim nation-states as potential multiple caliphates. In summary, he had argued that maintaining the religious character of governance was at the heart of an Islamic caliphate, and that it was possible, even necessary, for there to be many such constitutional governments emulating prophetic guidance to the best of their ability. This is a point that often people don't necessarily recognize. Islamic jurists, Muslim jurists like Mustafa Sabri were arguing for constitutional governments. And it wasn't just religious scholars, but even if you look in Turkey itself, among the nationalists, a very wide range of nationalists, whether they were religious or not religious, conservative or moderate, the whole spectrum, really sought before the abolition to uphold the Ottoman Caliphate as a constitutional monarchy. In Mustafa Sabri's estimation, an Islamic caliphate was necessarily comprised of two essential components: a constitutional government and representation of the Prophet in an attempt to look after people's religious and worldly affairs. Neither element without the other could be designated a caliphate. Yet in his work, Mustafa Sabri also opened the doors of caliphal designation more widely to say that any Muslim government fulfilling these two conditions might be considered a caliphate. In other words, even though it was customary to recognize only one caliphate at a time, Mustafa Sabri embraced the prospect of multiplicity. Indeed, he argued that it was permissible, even necessary, for there to be multiple governments to conduct the affairs of Muslims in distant lands. Then there was no obstacle, if that was the case, to recognize multiple caliphates, since it meant that those governments would be Islamically inspired. He conceded that it would be preferable for there to be one caliph for all Muslims, but doubted whether that was at all possible given contemporary circumstances. Ever the jurist, Mustafa Sabri was keenly focused on the application of Islamic law in realistic terms, not abstract ideals. His resolution of allowing for multiply Islamic-inspired governments therefore stemmed from Islamic legal guidelines on the Caliphate that recognized and perpetuated its essential elements of religious governments in a new landscape of emerging nation states. Intellectuals like Dr. Ali Abdurrazak, sorry, wrong person completely. Intellectuals like Dr. Abdurrazak As-Sanhouri, the Egyptian jurist who received his second doctorate in France, articulated visions of international councils along the lines of the League of Nations. Some have even considered As-Sanhouri to be the intellectual progenitor of the OIC, established in the late 1960s and early 70s as the organization of the Islamic Conference, now the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. So, for example, the Nigerian Secretary General of the OIC from 1989 to 1996, Hamad al-Ghabid, attributes the formation of the OIC to As-Sanhouri's ingenuity that enabled him to imagine and delineate a contemporary structure for an international organization to take the place of the traditional caliphate and still preserve the unity of the Muslim community across the world. Al-Ghabid concludes, "The solidarity," this is a quote, "the solidarity of Muslims in all parts of the world is now represented by an Islamic organization on an international scale that contributes internationally towards peaceful cooperation and the solidarity of humanity." Quote. Nearly 2 decades later, another Secretary General of the OIC, Ekmeleddin Ihsanoğlu, would affirm and recapitulate my own reading of As-Sanhouri's legacy in a retrospective of the institution's first 40 years. Far from dissipating without leaving behind any intellectual or institutional trace, the ferment of ideas and organizational activity following the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate in the 1920s leads us to the intriguing question of whether or not we can consider the OIC an alternative international model of the Caliphate in the modern era. Fifth category, religious scholars like Said Nursi focused instead on enduring metaphysical realities and cultivating people's personal faith and character. Here we have the spiritual focus of the other form of a caliphate, the inward one, not associated at all with politics. Nursi's understanding of the superiority of the spiritual domain over the base world of politics became the focus of his teachings in his later life, as well as permeated his interpretation of seminal moments in Islamic history. For instance, he explained that the Prophet's beloved grandsons, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, one who gave up his position as political caliph and the other who was martyred, were meant to become the authorities of the world's spiritual poles rather than mere commonplace governors. They were destined to become the font of spiritual guides who would inherit the prophetic mission and teach people how to balance and perfect their character. Nursi explains that they witnessed the ugly side of worldly politics at the hands of the Umayyads so that they would not feel any attachment to it in their hearts. They let go of a merely transient, superficial form of rule, political power, and gained an enduring, resplendent one, spiritual ascendancy. So in other words, there are 2 forms of caliphate. One is the outward caliphate, which relates to political power and is not inherently noble or honorable in and of itself. And the second is the inward caliphate, which inherits the core of the prophetic mission to elevate people's character and connect with the divine. All of these possible trajectories, the secular, the Islamist, the legal, the international, and the spiritual, have persisted until the present in continually evolving, changing permutations. Take this with me.
Well, that was fantastic and extremely informative, and I recommend the book to everyone longing for the lost caliphate.
because it is so historically rich and informative. And I think what's so interesting and important about Mona Hassan's work is her reminder to us of the importance of global comparative history. And I think that her work is ultimately quite convincing that the Caliphate is not necessarily most usefully thought of as a place, but rather as something at the critical and intangible intersection of faith and community, as I think was very nicely illustrated. But the Caliphate was, of course, place-based for centuries, however, and I'm interested in what functions that played in terms of bringing about the compatibility of religion and politics in our contemporary world, specifically of Islam and democracy. So the fact that it was place-based, I think, was critical for carrying out two important functions for that eventual coexistence of Islam with the modern state. And this, I think, is particularly the case in the final century of the Ottoman Caliphate, so from the 1820s to the 1920s. At that time, the place-based caliphate of the Ottoman Empire was no longer a military threat, despite its ambitions, but it did provide a meaningful diplomatic voice that broadly defended Muslims' religious interests in the international arena at a time when they were coming under very harsh attack. And the Caliphate also safeguarded Islam's holiest relics and sacred spaces, regardless of the legal school or sectarian status. And in the final decades of the 19th century in particular, the Ottoman Caliphate activated an extremely dense, meaningful global network of religious knowledge and scholarship, of prayer spaces, of prayer leaders, of waqfs or public foundations. And all of this was interrupted and lost. And the Ummah, the global Muslim community, was fractured upon its formal abolition 100 years ago this month. But while the Caliphate has been gone for 100 years, like many other intellectual ideas and institutions, its influence can still be felt in the impressions that it left behind. We are now living in a world defined by its absence. The moment of its disappearance was a key turning point for global Islam, and I think that was just very nicely illustrated. It left behind many disappointed millions of believers, leading in part to the Khilafah movement that we heard about in both sessions this morning, and to the rise of political Islam, emblematized by Hassan al-Banna in one of Mona's slides. And the reason why I think this legacy is so visible is because some of their disgruntled descendants continue to be the most visible actors on the religious political stage, who have the most enduring grievances with the post-colonial order. And so this is occurring in a context of contested religious leadership and in a context of the reality of a fragmented Muslim community. And as a result, there are very few bases for consensus upon who can settle major issues of coexistence of Islam and the state, or to weigh in on the major conflicts in the international arena, as Salim alluded to. The end result today is instead a patchwork of dozens of national ministries of Islamic affairs, which for the time being are a far cry from modern caliphates. And there is also a smattering of international organizations, such as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, assorted treaties, but they almost all suffer from a fatal flaw of proximity to Western military powers. The counterfactual that you mention in your book, I think, is so tantalizing. What if the Caliph had been allowed to remain in Istanbul in March 1924? Well, as a scholar of politics and institutions, I'm actually agnostic as to whether it is the natural state of things in Islam to impose such a centralized voice or institution upon a complex living organism like a global faith community. But by way of comparison, interestingly, the Roman Catholic papacy experienced a close call with extinction around the exact same time in the 1920s, when European powers, in fact, some of the same European powers, were also considering whether or not the Pope might be removed from Rome. Now, since the 19th century, the Church had had an adversarial relationship with the modern international order, and wherever possible, it injected the open conflict of the Roman question into the heart of international politics. And it's quite surprising to think about the contingent reasons the papacy survived so that it could later achieve a lasting, peaceful relationship with the modern nation state. So I believe this overall transformation can be attributed to two moments. I admit that I'm constantly in search of analogies for how this might take place with the Muslim world. Two moments were, first, the creation of the Vatican City as a sovereign state. And the second was the convening of the Second Vatican Council, around 40, 50 years later, completed in the early 1960s, which cemented a commitment to pluralism and respect for other faiths. And I've got to say that both of these key moments were highly unanticipated and in some sense undesired just a few short years before they took place. But it was through these processes that the Church has been able to let go, in my view, of the ambition of office holding and the ambition of political administrative control over the faithful, and instead to return to what Mona was referring to as the kind of inward area, to return to its pastoral role, where church leaders can be beacons and advocates and religious service providers for Catholics worldwide. Now, of course, these two religions are not perfect analogs, but both religions, their believers, their leaders, their representatives, all exist within a world fashioned by nation states and need to learn to live with their effective relegation to the spiritual realm, right, despite their initial intentions. And so, as with the case of the Khilafah movement taking place in the teens and 20s of the 20th century, there was also vocal resistance to the end of the Pope's temporal rule. But unlike with the Khilafah movement, those voices were functionally silenced by the quote-unquote resolution of the Roman question with this neat postage stamp-sized sovereign nation-state within the global nation-state order. Now, that doesn't mean that Catholics living in democracies stopped fighting for the realization of their values, but they used democratic political participation to do so, and the church leadership took itself out of the business of executive office holding in political systems. And this was not an inevitable outcome. It was certainly not the desired outcome of the 19th century popes, but it is highly dependent on the contingent survival of the papacy and its global institutional network, that the church was able to reorganize itself for coexistence with the modern nation state, so that today, Catholic hierarchies around the world can run their own seminaries and make their own appointments to the offices of bishop or cardinal. And this outcome stands in very sharp contrast with the immense loss of knowledge of centuries of Ottoman jurisprudence, with the elimination of foundations and seminaries and networks and circulating scholars and ulama. So it contrasts with that, and it also contrasts with the current state of state-controlled religion that is seen in so much of the contemporary Muslim world, and which is why the contemporary nation-states do not resemble modern caliphates. And have to do with how should we think about the loss of the caliphate in these terms? How do you, Mona, essentially assess this loss? Is it on the one hand that the Muslim worldwide ummah has dodged a bullet in a way because no individual could hope to be sufficiently representative of the diverse ummah? Or is it a missed opportunity? The absence of an institutional moral center, a way to separate the wheat and to declare what is un-Islamic. In the absence of an individual leader or a caliph-like figure, what or who else might accomplish or oversee the currently unexpected separation of religious and political authority in the Muslim world so as to unambiguously permit participation in plural democratic life? A secondary question concerns the broader implications of who will govern over the very concrete places of the religion's holy cities. So the religion's holy sites are obviously real existing places with enormous significance to hundreds of millions, and somebody has to serve as custodian. For a portion of Muslim public opinion, however, the two families currently in charge of Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina are considered illegitimate. So does this matter? To what extent does the lack of resolution of these large geopolitical questions interfere with the coexistence of Islam and contemporary democracy, in your view? So thank you again so much for your keynote, and feel free to take up any of these observations or questions as you see fit, and I'll join you over here for that.
Thank you for those wonderful remarks. And as you know, because I know you've read the book, although some people in the audience might not have, it was very important for me while writing this book, not just to think about Islamic history, but to look at other religious communities that have struggled with similar issues, whether it was concerning the temple or it was concerning the papacy. And I think what's really fascinating, as you alluded to in your remarks as well, is that in the 1920s, Muslims themselves were thinking very carefully about what was happening with the papacy. So you have a range of suggestions. You have people writing into the Caliphate conference that was held in Cairo in 1926, saying, do you want me to bring you all of the information about how they, someone from Bosnia actually, how they elect a pope, and we can consider that as part of our deliberations. Even more interesting are the British spy documents that have been disclosed about Turkish nationalists themselves discussing about turning Istanbul into something like the Vatican. So that was something that it seems, was on the table in the time period, although Mustafa Kemal Ataturk very ruthlessly and very brilliantly outmaneuvered all of his colleagues who had supported him in the Turkish nationalist movement. I actually wanted to come back to a point that Salim had mentioned at the beginning too, because this is something that, of course, the official historiographic narrative leaves out, but the Turkish war for independence was waged on the foundation of preserving the Ottoman Caliphate. So that's how they amassed support within Anatolia, but also internationally. So the Khilafat movement was a very important support, but also you have, they were gathering resources, funds that were really critical from places like North Africa as well. So it's convenient to kind of pretend that there was no international support for an Ottoman Caliphate, but it was very much integral to the resistance movement or the war for independence that actually ended up establishing the Republic of Turkey. With the analogies also in thinking about Muslims and Catholics in the 20th century, Jose Casanova, of course, has argued that it was the loss of territorial sovereignty that allowed the papacy to be reconstituted as the core of a transnational religious regime. And you talk about this in your book as well, again, pointing back to contemporaries who are seeing that same process happening. And you can see that among Muslims as well. I mean, there was one thing where you had said, I took notes on your remarks, so let me see what you said. You talked about the relegation of the caliphate to the spiritual realm. And I think it's important to recognize that. So that last vision of the contemporary vision of the caliphate, of the spiritual, is not something that emerges in the contemporary moment. It's not something that emerges in the 1920s. People who adopt that view would not say it's a relegation. They would say that's the foundation of the caliphate. That is the true, what you call the pastoral mission, right? To attempt to model a mission of mercy and love and compassion and peace and justice. All of these wonderful things is at the core, and the political is what's extraneous. So people who are familiar with Islamic history know that the first 30 years are described as the era of the rightly guided caliphs. And that's because it's seen that the political rulers attempted to follow this prophetic model of governance. So they conjoined the spiritual with the political, but in fact it separates. I mean, you no longer have that conjunction after 30 years. So this is actually what secularists or Islamic modernists used to argue for secular governance in the 1920s. So you have Said Bey in Turkey says that, look, there actually is no real fully constituted caliphate in this full sense of the political, spiritual sense of the term since 30 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death. So all of this is extraneous. But even within a religious framework of people who want to see models of Islamic governance, there's still a recognition of a secular model that is a religious model. I know that sounds like it's a mind twister, but one of our colleagues, Sherman Jackson, has been writing a book for quite some time about the Islamic secular. And this goes back to really important discussions from the pre-modern era that recognize the different places for different segments of society and the people who are responsible for that. So it's not a theocratic model, and that's why I think it's important to remember that in the 1920s, so many people are advocating for a constitutional government, right? And certainly democracy and parliaments and all of this are integral to that vision of it.
Thank you very much. We don't have much time. I will collect. Ooh. Is it okay if I collect 3 questions and then you can answer quickly? I'm sorry, forgot the name.
Jonathan.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't need a mic, then I don't think you need it for the thing. Okay, I'm trying to think of a question that within the 5 minutes. One of those interesting observation that it's 2 Turkic military leaders that abolished the Caliphate, right? I didn't put it together in the sense of Pelagu, right, coming in and into Baghdad, and then Mustafa Kemal. I think to make it, you said at the very end of it, make it very explicit, like who abolishes the Caliphate is a Turkish secular nation builder that kind of switches, baits and switches in the sense of that early struggle you mentioned, that they are very actively reconstituting some kind of a Muslim polity and bonding Turks and Kurds even in that early phase. And it actually really, 1924 shifts the Kurds into the Azadi movement, et cetera, that kind of comes out of that. My question is, like, does the Caliphate, it feels like, I guess for me, from a skeptical standpoint, is that it feels like it's extremely powerful, like maybe thinking of a caliphate not without a place, but a caliphate without a caliph, or caliphate without a caliphate in a sense. It's like it's more of a kind of symbolic aspiration or a kind of a longing that it has a real kind of importance in that, because it feels like it's totally normal. You mentioned this, very easy to function as a Muslim without a caliphate. It'd be very hard to function without Mecca and Medina, without a place that anchors you. And I'm somewhat thinking of this from the perspective of the far west, from Morocco, where they really couldn't care a lot. They have not cared much about an Ottoman caliph or even the Abbasid caliph or the Umayyad caliph. They've lived their entire kind of Muslim arc of history in a way that was not central. So I think, I'm trying to think of the Sultanate versus Caliphate and how much the Caliphate as it often has no or little institutional apparatus, but it is a very important symbolic kind of a arc over an ummah in a kind of aspirational sense that you can, I'm trying to think, it's like a kind of fuzziness, I guess, in the way to function.
Yeah. I think one way to kind of help clarify some of that fuzziness is to think of the Caliphate and its cultural religious significance as representing connectivity to the Prophet Muhammad himself, right? And
it's like
so,
apostolic succession, but a kind of,
right, but in terms of the Caliph, if you look at the Abbasid Caliph and even the Ottomans, through really, again, amazing legal discussions, connect the Caliph through a chain of rule back to the Prophet Muhammad himself, right? So you actually do find that Muslims in Morocco are horrified at the loss of the Ottoman Caliph, which, again, we would not necessarily expect. Same thing with the Abbasids. You find that Muslims in Cordoba are like writing as if the sky has fallen, everybody's drunk with fear, metaphorically, everybody's losing it, even though they're also in a completely different realm under a completely different ruler, because of the symbolism, right? That they're functioning under local regimes, if you will, local polities that may even use the term caliphate, but it's understood to be regional as opposed to an institution that has a universal aspiration. and is seen as that mode of connection back to the Prophet Muhammad. And that's why you see in the absence of an Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, you see these other modes of connectivity, other modes of connection to the prophetic model really strengthen in importance, whether that's a poetic praise of the Prophet Muhammad, whether that's the manifestation of the, again, the spiritual brotherhoods or orders, the Sufi networks. You see that also becoming more prominent in this time period. And all of these things, interesting that John Bull, again, points to as the different means of connecting the ummah, this sort of discursive community. And those take greater importance in this period of absence. And it's interesting because, again, when you look at some of these models, they would then say there's really not an absence, in the sense that if you look at the first three, those are all nation-state models. So they're all able to function within a particular, this is like an ongoing discussion, right, of what it means to have or not have a caliphate. And actually the all first four are all nation-state models. Because the international one, if you consider the OIC a modern caliphate, is based on the nation states representing in an international forum as well. That would certainly be a failed caliphate, but it would still be a caliphate, right? And the spiritual one, again, is seen as an enduring caliphate. That is the real version. The political one can kind of come and go because there are representatives that continue to represent a prophetic model for humanity.
Final question. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Quickly, Mona already answered my question for Jonathan, which is why there wasn't a city-state in Istanbul like the Vatican was created by the Lateran Treaty. But for you, Mona, you mentioned constitutional monarchy. Did Ataturk ever give serious consideration to Abdul Majid or his brother being a constitutional monarch? And secondly, did the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as the custodian of the two holy shrines, consider KSA was established in 1932, but it inherited Hejaz. And the only point I'll make is the daughter, Abdul Majid, Princess Dureshawar, married the son of the Nizam, and the Nizam entertained hopes of being the next caliph, but he was deposed shortly after independence by the Indian army. So much for him. Thank you.
Priya, you may also raise your question as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll try to be quick. This is, I guess, a question for Jonathan to push back a little bit on the idea that the papacy succeeded in some way where the caliphate didn't. Obviously, the outcomes were different, but if we look at it from the perspective of the Caliphate movement, the South Asian movement, what are the stakes of preserving the caliphate were, even though we know that the prime authentic understanding of it is that it's a pastoral role, the stakes in sort of everyday understanding at that time was that it's not just the caliphate, it's a sultanate, and it's someone who had, sorry, the picture is distracting me, sort of someone who has temporal power, an alternative vision of statesmanship, if you will, right? Going back to the earlier conversation we had about alternative paradigms to the nation-state paradigm. I mean, the Caliphate movement is one of those movements that's looking for that, and it's because the caliphate ends that you get then the rise of the Pakistan movement. They're connected, right? So, of course, the papacy survived, but as something that can coexist alongside the nation-state, and in a way, the fact that it turned out that way helped to consecrate, you know, I'm using that word metaphorically, but in a way, maybe more than metaphorically, the nation-state system as the only system. Because the end of this other form of statesmanship, this other form of temporal authority that combines sacred authority with the end of the caliphate and then the papacy being remade in this very, like, you can stand on the side and remind us of our moral, obligations. What do you think of that interpretation?
Well, I would say that the technical specifications of the Vatican City are still very important because it is a sovereign ruler with a certain number of citizens. And of course, you could say it validates the nation-state system, or it's the opposite, right? I mean, you could say that here's the really important point of orientation for the faithful worldwide. And conveniently, it has the same diplomatic legal status. I guess that's the main point I would bring back to all of this, is that these statuses matter in international politics because it matters who can sign treaties and who can govern places and grant permission to access places. It's just the world we're living in. It's not even, I don't have a moral view of it. But I would say that was the genius of it, was to actually grant that the Pope should not be the subject of any other potentate or ruler, but should rather be his own sovereign, and thus, therefore, like the Caliph, be the sort of shadow of God here on earth, at least in one spot, which allows for a lot of internal consistency to survive into the era.
I think the fact that it has territorial sovereignty really doesn't.
So we agree.
Yeah, when you're talking, you were saying that it's coexisting, but
Yes, I don't think that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk seriously considered retaining this model. I mean, it's interesting because he's not the one who proposed the separation of the Sultanate or political power from the Caliphate, which is the Caliphate, or this religious model. But he was very, he capitalized on it, right? Once that happened and once that was introduced. And what's fascinating is the person who introduced that separation of political power from the Caliphate, later on in his memoirs, was bewailing what transpired in the gap, sort of this vacuum that they had left in terms of what would take its place. I mean, that was their critical political error, if you will, is they negated something and didn't put something else in its place. And Ataturk took advantage of that, of course. But in his memoirs, he talks about the abolition of the Caliphate as insanity. And this is someone who's not a religious individual. He talks about it from a political standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, as like sheer madness, and actually points out and says even Mussolini didn't abolish the papacy. And so there's this recognition of the role that could have played, but I don't think that was part of Mustafa Kemal's vision as it transpired. And to come back to this point about, Jonathan, what you mentioned about sort of this unexpected separation of religion and politics, is that I think it's important to recognize that whether it's in Turkey or whether it's in the United States, both religion and secularism constitute each other, right? So if you look at, just to talk about the United States, is that our courts and our Supreme Court, even before the current constitution of the Supreme Court, are constantly adjudicating questions of religion. Like, what is the appropriate domain of religion? What is the appropriate expression of religion, and so on. And so it's almost a myth to think of a separation of church and state, because they're so enmeshed in our system that we have this model of adjudicating what are the appropriate domains of religion.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for lunch, I assume. Thank you for
Yes.
joining us, and join me for a good clap. It's not abolished, it's transferred to the parliament, right? Technically.